Silicon Valley is the ultimate example of bringing together the best and brightest, and you get an explosion coming out of it. The story of Silicon Valley really begins, unquestionably, with one of the smartest people who ever lived, and his name was William Shockley.
Think through. Same facts as WS, different viewpoint. Suggestion. Have them report to Noyce.
The whole story is almost all about the father figure to the pseudo-sons that ran the valley. The one that mattered the most was Shockley's favorite, and that was Bob Noyce.
Good evening. When the 20th century comes to a close, historians may well record it not as the era of the auto, or even that of the computer. The real driving force, the one that was truly revolutionary in its impact on our lives, will be perceived as semiconductor electronics. The ability to move electrons through small chips of silicon.
Imagine our world without electronics. It wasn't that long ago.
William Bradford Shockley, California Institute of Technology, class of 32, PhD from MIT in 36.
My godmother actually had been part of William Shockley's family. I knew he was a famous scientist. I did not know about some of the more unusual parts of his belief system until much later.
I had IQ tests made by Terman in connection with the Gifted Children's Study when I was about 10, the famous study done by Lewis M. Terman.
His mother told me about how his father had been determined he would be a famous scientist and hopefully a Nobel Prize winner, and his whole life had been focused on that.
I was not accepted to the Terman study because my IQ was not high enough.
Somebody said to me once that they thought that Shockley was the smartest human being since Isaac Newton. Now remember, there's Einstein in there, in between, and they didn't list Einstein.
I've heard that Einstein was not a very bright student in his early years.
He considered himself a genius. When you read his notebooks, Shockley made it clear that he wanted to have his notes survive.
During the last 5 minutes of my life, should I have my intellectual powers intact, I hope to consider...
He really wanted to make sure that people understood how brilliant he was.
Keeping with the objective of Nobel's will, of conferring greatest benefit on mankind.
Hands down, William Shockley was the most important man in semiconductor physics. He was the man who oversaw the team that invented the transistor.
Transistor, an electronic switching device made from semiconducting material that acts as a valve for the flow of electrical current.
Technology 101. Everything is about the switch. And when I say a switch, I literally mean a switch. The great breakthrough, maybe the greatest breakthrough of them all, is the idea that you don't have to have anything mechanical turn on and off the flow of electricity. You can just have a stream of electrons do it. That's the vacuum tube. You can get an amplifier, a television set, you can get radar. But they burned out all the time, and you bumped them wrong, and they broke. It was a monumental pain. And then to have a switch come that's literally made out of the elemental materials of the universe, and it's solid state. There's no moving parts, there's no vacuum, you can't break it. Theoretically lasts almost forever, and it's unbelievably fast and uses very little power.
It's a transistor, no bigger than a kernel of corn.
It changes everything. You can hit it with a baseball bat. It still might work.
It's groovy, isn't it?
first was the difference between those big tabletop radios and the little bitty transistor radios that became the rage.
Oh, you gals out there just running around thinking you got a good man.
In fact, the radio was often called a transistor. The transistor was a little gadget inside.
I'm a man who knows just what to do. And you know just what you've been missing when I get through with you.
Shockley's original device was intended for telephone switching.
Hello?
Our research people are hard at work finding out what else it may be able to do, where else we may be able to put it to use.
Oh, the ladies know me when I go out on the town.
I think early on, everyone knew that you were going to open up all kinds of new applications. Now, whether they thought that, you'd have your teenage daughters, walking down the street with an iPod in their ear, I'm not sure they thought that far ahead.
This away, you're gonna break right down and say, 'cause I'm the satisfier.
A device called a transistor, which has several applications in radio, where a vacuum tube ordinarily is employed, was demonstrated for the first time yesterday at Bell Telephone Laboratories.
There had been an enormous amount of acrimony at Bell Labs over who did what and who invented what.
Contained none of the conventional tubes. It also was shown in a telephone system and a television unit controlled by a receiver on a lower floor.
The team below Shockley, two men named Bardeen and Bratton, got a good deal of the credit for the transistor.
And that it will create and send radio waves.
If you look at the story closely, Rattain and Bardeen run into a handful of technical problems, go down the hallway and ask Bill Shockley some questions. He solves it for them, but they did all the work.
There's the famous picture of Shockley sitting looking through a microscope with two people in the background. I think that's the first time in his life he ever looked through a microscope.
He was a very, very jealous man, a very competitive man, a very, very brilliant man, and he decided, I'm going to go off and invent an even better transistor.
Within 90 days formation, Shockley Transistor Corporation. Present projects on dollar basis. Uniform accounting procedures, meaningful...
Shockley believed in the concept of what he called hot mines. He sought out, in all corners of the United States, hot mines, one by one by one.
Greenwich, Victor, electrical engineer. Julius Blank, Western Electric, mechanical engineer.
Making semiconductors involves chemistry, physics, optics, thermodynamics, and that's hard to do with one or two guys.
Jean Herny, Swiss mathematician. J.T. Last, MIT, Cambridge.
We were all real young and had a sense of adventure.
Kleiner, Eugene, mechanical engineer. C.S. Roberts, that's Sheldon, metallurgy.
They were all cowboys. They were crazy, they were hard drinking, they were skirt chasing, and they were brilliant.
Everybody thought we were nuts, but you have to be a little crazy once in a while.
Right, I thought, boy, this sounds like a neat opportunity, and really kind of jumped at it.
Gordon E. Moore, super technician, good glass blower, does not cause trouble, almost too honest. Large group, strong candidates, thinks he was top half.
He didn't say, hello, Jim, nice to have you, looking forward to working with you, whatever it is that you might think as preliminaries. He said, well, I like to have my new employees take a test.
IQ, intelligence quotient, very sound.
Shockley sent me to a psychologist in New York.
Personally, very nice. Needs direction.
This test covered a whole multitude of things, perception and reasoning and that kind of stuff.
Originality tends to stick to a subject, i.e., inflexible.
His wife was a psychiatrist, and she would often sit in the background take notes on what our nervous tics or whatever we were doing. I don't know. But
Strong need for recognition. Little patience with others. Definite. Worm's eye view needed.
He's got his stopwatch in his hand. And he says, 127 people enter a tennis tournament. How many matches do you have to play to determine the winner?
Would you rather be the conductor or the motorman on a streetcar?
But lo and behold, out of it comes a big, thick dossier analysis. I never saw mine, but I saw some other people's, and this is really something to behold.
Noyce, Robert. Turner 6-8069. Would like to live on West Coast. Fair performance on wire, on turntable, and goldfish bowl. Average hard worker. Not bad, not best. Not a manager.
Dear home, after just working around the physics lab up to now, I'm getting in on something interesting. I feel encouraged working with men doing research, for they must know their field thoroughly and are interested in it enough to make their interest contagious.
Bob had one thing that none of the rest of the group did. He had actually been exposed to transistors. He had seen some of the first ones to come out of Bell Laboratories, so that put him in a natural leadership position among the group.
I also got to wondering if I could still be a person working with physical things, which are always the same, or if I should instead be a person who works with people and brains, which are never stagnant.
Bob Noyce had a charm about him. He had a curious mind. And when you couple that with his brilliance, it's just kind of an unstoppable force. People just wanted to believe Bob Noyce and go where Bob led them.
He was a real gutsy character. He was an athlete, smoked a lot, took huge risks. Your classic man's man. You wanted to be Bob Noyce when you grew up.
Bob grew up in Iowa. He was a preacher's son. He read voraciously. He talked to lots of different kinds of people. And he could take all this information and put it together into seeing what might be ahead. He was literally scanning to try to figure out what the future would look like. He was really good at that.
Talked to Noyce. Don't let inexperience wander. Clean off silicon wafers electrolytically, then oxidize. Trade secret method, necessary to get stable units. Channel over regrown region is smaller. Breakdown depends on base material.
Shockley made an extremely good decision to work with silicon instead of germanium. Up till that point, transistors have been made with germanium.
Germanium fell apart, or at least had significant problems under stress, particularly under heat. Silicon was much harder to work with, but once you got something that worked, it worked.
Silicon, the second most abundant element on Earth, next to oxygen, most commonly found in the form of sand.
When you go to the beach and you let the sand run between your toes, you are playing with silicon.
It's the new crude oil. The silicon transistors were the underlying technology to drive the entire information revolution.
When they told me they were going to work on transistors, Gene Kleiner said to me, "What is a transistor?" The learning curve was, was pretty tough.
We didn't quite know what we were doing. And also, we didn't understand the nature of unwanted impurities.
All of a sudden you need gases that are impurities to 5 decimal points out. Well, good luck.
We were still smoking in the lab, and it was a miracle that anything worked. And also, we had to build all of our own equipment.
Getting anything done around this area at that time was tough. Nothing was here. I ran around the country 3 or 4 times trying to find people to build furnaces, and they all threw me out. So I said, okay, I have to build it myself.
I got a hold of Bausch and Lomb and said, we're going to need 20 of these stereo microscopes. He said, we make 6 of these a year.
You didn't have Google to deal with. You had to pick up the telephone book and make calls and interrogate people face to face.
28 military contracts on different base transistors. Contracts based on best production experience.
Shockley did an awful lot of his work in classified military programs. So the market was going to be military. he had contacts.
Charles F. Yost, Air Force Office of Scientific Research, Washington, D.C., Liberty 5-6700.
New technology, especially fundamentally new technology, is oftentimes really expensive. The military oftentimes the only people that will buy this stuff.
Rough preliminary proposal, negotiations underway October to November, possibly negotiated by end of 56. Nobel, royal family, Queen, medal.
I remember drinking champagne at 9 o'clock in the morning.
It was a very loose organization in those days.
None of us were quite used to drinking champagne that time in the morning, so.
Nobel Prize, established in 1859 in the will of Swedish chemist Alfred Nobel, honors contributions conferring the greatest benefit on mankind.
It may be appropriate to speculate at this point about the future of transistor electronics. Those who have worked intensively in the field share the author's feeling of great optimism regarding the ultimate potentialities. It is my hope to contribute to the fulfillment of the predictions through my new organization in California.
Shockley became an instant celebrity, and he was invited to labs all over the world.
Talk with W. Harries, London. In Madrid, January 30th. Gunther Christian, Tübingen, Germany. République Le Molineux, Seine, France.
He'd make frequent trips, so he wasn't around very much. And then we'd come back, he'd report on his visitations to the labs and set us up on a new series of experiments. Okay, but we didn't finish the last ones.
I talked to Noyce about plans, also to Moore. Both said I was changing rules.
He changed his product direction away from a transistor to an obscure device, a 4-layer diode.
Basic material. 2mm slices.
He wanted to make a device beyond the transistor, a device that was really just his.
Figures on 4-layer diode? Terribly optimistic.
He was yanking you around all the time.
All these people had come out to build transistors with the inventor, the godfather of the transistor, and now they're not supposed to be working on transistors?
We got yanked back and forth between these two competing things that he thought he could do at the same time.
This is the way I am. This is one of my scientific assets. The vacillation must reestablish authority.
There were stories of him calling some of his old Bell Lab buddies to find out if these kids knew what they were talking about.
Unstable per Noyce. Instability due to WS.
Eventually it got to a point where it became, it didn't make any sense.
Trouble. On group meeting, there were at least 2. They said they would resign en masse if something were not done. If this is intentioned, let's work out terminations starting now.
We discovered that a bunch of us young kids had trouble pushing a new Nobel laureate aside.
Anybody who ever dealt with William Shockley came away thinking that he was the smartest human being they'd ever met. They also came away thinking he was a monster.
It took a lot of doing to go behind my back. Felt they couldn't talk to WS.
Someone cut their finger on a pushpin that broke off on their bulletin board, and Shockley thought it was a big conspiracy. He started to bring in detectives.
We became very uncomfortable.
We were all thinking of leaving individual and going our own ways, and we wanted to figure some way we could stay together as a group.
Bob was uncomfortable with this whole thing in the beginning. I think he was kind of chickening out.
Noyce was Shockley's favorite.
He and Bob were close.
What to do about Noyce? Good technician, but immature. Well, he could walk out with WS. think it may work out. I hope it does.
I've looked back on my two primary reasons for coming out here: to work with Shockley and to come to the West Coast. The importance of the first has been greatly diminished by finding out that the great aren't much better than the average.
And I told him, we're going to go and see these fellas in the city, and there'll be 7 of us there, but you're welcome to show up. And when they went to pick me up at the car, I got in, I looked in the back seat, and there in the last row is Bobby Noyce. And I said, well, welcome aboard, good to have you. They said, it's good to be here.
It's all about the people. Shockley put together, this team of guys that became, as he put it, the traitorous 8.
And we went to see Art Rock, who could be looked on as a first venture capitalist. Matter of fact, he coined the word.
We had a list of, I guess it was about 35 companies to invest in them. All of them liked the idea. None of them bit.
The 8 of us got together and said, what should we do now?
We'd all have to go out and look for jobs.
Someone accidentally at the last minute said, why don't you go see Sherman Fairchild? Well, I heard of the name, because you see his picture in the paper all the time. He used to be a playboy hanging around El Morocco in New York with his buddy Howie Hughes. They had all the fancy showgirls tied up in New York.
He liked inventors, he liked young people, and he decided that Fairchild Camera and Instrument would do the deal we were suggesting.
In order to seal the deal, evidently some value had to be exchanged.
Someone brought a fistful of brand spanking new dollar bills. We just signed them one after the other, and each one took one and stuck to the way, and that was the Silicon Valley Declaration of Independence.
Wednesday, 18 September. Group resigns.
Shockley didn't quite believe it, I don't think.
He was profoundly affected by this.
The departure of the 8 will have no real effect on Shockley Labs.
They saw what Shockley was trying to do and realized they could do it better.
We knew that we could make a device in silicon that the world really needed and wanted. We could do it.
Starting Fairchild, we started over again.
When you're absolute beginners, it's a panoramic view.
We have $1 million guaranteed, with yours truly as director of R&D.
And the kingdom is for you.
Bobby used to swipe cigarettes without even asking. See, those are the days when you could have 4 conversations at once. That was the fun part. Fairchild in New York sent a delegation out, and here comes these guys with hats and suits and coats and ties and overcoats. They looked like, gangsters from New York. They have no clue as to what it's like here.
We worked without any real overall leadership. It was a cooperative effort.
We're still getting things put together, and all of a sudden, we see this thing out, Sputnik.
Четыре, 3, 2, 1. Пусть.
President Eisenhower today signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act in the effort to stay afoot with Russia's space program.
Their timing turned out to be perfect.
There was a feeling that that was going to be the beginning of a very large spending program to go chase Sputnik.
These guys went into an empty building in October 1957, and by the following August, less than a year later, they had built the first batch of successful commercial transistors. They had changed the world.
We sold our first 100 devices for $150 a piece.
Sherman Fairchild was the largest holder of IBM stock, so first devices were purchased by IBM, I think with the help of his contacts.
We scooped the industry. Nobody is ready to put something like this on the market. No prospect of anybody getting in our way in the immediate future.
That was for an F-108 fighter, which was a nuclear-powered fighter, if you'll believe this story.
These all went in very secret government programs, so these first devices are almost impossible to find.
Electronics for combat means new concepts, new tools, new weapons.
And I had misgivings about building military equipment. It's hard now to go back and think what things were really like in the Cold War days. Everybody was scared to death. The school kids were hiding under their desks and all that stuff.
To duck and cover.
Fairchild. IBM. 100 transistors at $100 apiece. Purchase order in November or December.
Shockley hired basically a mole at Fairchild Semiconductor to report back to him on what was happening there.
December 57. They had products developed. They had committed.
Fairchild's first products were things that could legitimately be traced to work that they had done at Shockley's.
2 terminal NPN licensee? Not. Widespread rumor and conversation. Plan ahead. Plan ahead.
William Shockley never came close to making $1 million as a businessman. His company was sold not too long after the group of 8 left.
We'd never had much direct contact with him after that. I don't think I exchanged any word with him after that, and I've never spoken to him since.
When I joined Fairchild, I was 24 years old, and this was pretty new stuff to me. I was selling their product line primarily to defense contractors in Southern California. It was when we decided to go into the consumer market that Fairchild really started to blossom. At the time, the FCC chairman was a guy named Newton Minnow.
Keep your eyes glued to that set until the station signs off. I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Newton Minnow is such an unusual name, it's hard to forget that name. He edicted that all TV sets would have to have UHF capability. Well, this required a whole new UHF amplifier in the receiver, and of course, transistors.
We make sure the notch in the UHF wafer switch is in the 1 o'clock position.
We were trying to sell a silicon transistor, which had been selling for $150 into military applications. Suddenly you had the prospect of selling, millions or tens of millions of these devices, but the price had to be down in the $1.50 range. Bob said, I think we should go for it. And I was blown away. Think we could go for it. What, a product I've been selling for $150? We're now going to start making commitments for $1.50? That was just vintage Bob Noyce. Listen to the facts, see what has to happen, and make the decision. Let's go for it.
Bob Noyce told me that we were going to have TVs that could hang on the wall, and I thought he was hallucinating because they had those great big tubes and everything in them, and I just thought he was, like I say, hallucinating. He was not, but he just had a vision.
If you hit a wall, you back up until you can find a way conceptually all the way to the end. And once you get to the point that you can see the top of the mountain, then you know you can get there.
Bob was a tinkerer from the beginning. I was a chemist, so I blew things up. We were scientists. We thrived on problems.
Vanguard's tens of thousands of delicate parts, its miles of electrical circuits, there's room for lots to go wrong. And the slightest malfunction at this stage means this. One circuit in the control system breaks down and Defense Department cameras record a pinwheel of fire.
The military had been pushing for some kind of micro-miniature electronics by hook or by crook for some time.
The problem was, as circuits became more and more complex, the number of transistors and the connections you needed grew exponentially.
This is all hands-on stuff. And you had to do scores of these things on a printed circuit board to do anything sophisticated like a computer.
Connector reliability is one of the major limitations of the system. Failures happen when the connectors don't work.
We're talking about 100,000 components.
It's a tyranny of numbers. You can prove mathematically that it will never work. Nothing will ever happen.
Methods of isolating multiple devices. In many applications now, it would be desirable to make multiple devices on a...
It was all a question of can you make two devices on the same piece of silicon?
In order to make interconnections between devices as part of the manufacturing process.
We convinced ourselves that yes, indeed, we could make a device with probably 4 or 8 transistors.
The integrated circuit, a set of miniaturized electronic components on a single piece of semiconducting material, also known as the microchip. First produced by Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments.
In the late 1950s, Jack Kilby does some doodles in his notebook, and he comes up with basically a germanium cube with wires going in and out of it. Out here in California, you have Bob Noyce doing the same doodle, except his doodle is actually workable.
That's the history of technology, like Bell with the telephone. He was not the only one that was working on telephones at that time, put it mildly.
Now, you actually got to build the damn thing.
The problem with the integrated circuit is how do you interconnect the semiconductors? How do you run a wire across to connect them? And you have to electrically isolate the devices. They have to be their own individual device.
Sean Horney, who's almost forgotten now, comes up with a way to create metal circuits that are flat. The old way, switches had always been three-dimensional, vacuum tubes, transistors. And now this breakthrough, suddenly the transistor goes from 3 dimensions to 2, it goes flat, and it becomes a printing process.
This is possible using Horney's method. Now let's explore every possible way that we can do this.
The idea changed the industry completely.
Noyce and Kilby are credited with the integrated circuit, but Horney is the guy who makes it all possible.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
It was the age of the space race and all of our streamlined electronics and cars, and there was this real sense that it was technology that had gotten us ahead and that would keep us ahead as a nation.
This is not a change only for the engineer. I think it's a change for the whole society.
I was watching Alan Shepard's thing. We had a lot of stuff in that. Just keeping my fingers crossed.
We had one problem. The world didn't want an integrated circuit.
I would stop into Jay's office and he said, yeah, I got the world's whole supply of integrated circuits in my drawer. And he opens the drawer and there's a little petri dish with maybe 6 or 7 circuits on it. I said, that's it?
We sold transistors to circuit designers who wanted to build their own circuits. And if we sold them a complete circuit, that put them out of business.
The irony is, integrated circuits now comprise the electronic guts of just about everything we take for granted in the modern world.
If we're going to make integrated circuits, we've got to know what systems and system functions that the integrated circuits will go into. Trying to define what makes sense.
Bob decided he would sell people the integrated circuit for less than the parts so they could build their own circuitry.
Toasters, blenders, household appliances, etc.
Fairchild cut prices based on what they thought the eventual market would be, just to get the market going.
I mean, I think if we wouldn't have been able to get to a price where you could actually use it in a consumer application, you wouldn't have had the explosive growth that followed.
Bob was, from the time we started the company, was searching all over the place for customers and new uses for integrated circuits and transistors.
The Japanese food is very interesting, particularly the raw fish, which I like very much. Experiencing the contrasting cultures was thoroughly enjoyable.
I met him a couple of times in Japan. He's a great inventor, great technologist, but also he was a very good salesman.
Noyce was shrewd and knew that these were people who were interested in building what Fairchild was building.
After the war, Japan was a very poor country. They do not have the natural resources or energies, or food is very severe shortage. So there was nothing to export. So in those days, made in Japan meant something cheap, something low quality. That was the beginning of the rise of Japan.
Most of their work in silicon transistors was experimental pilot line type work, and they had nothing in production. Most of the technology they have, they've gained through licensing agreements.
It turned out that we could make a lot of money by licensing the Japanese on this. The Fairchild patent pool is producing several $1 million a year. It sounded like a lot of money for just opening envelopes and taking the check out.
In terms of integrated circuits shipped, last month we shipped more than the entire industry did in January. There are orders now, instead of in the 10,000 piece quantity, in the 500,000 and million quantity.
The number of integrated circuits in use today in the world exceeds the population of human beings.
We turned it into a mass production industry. We were the Henry Fords of the transistor business.
You could argue that Fairchild Semiconductor is the most interesting company in American history. It is the craziest company in American history and is probably the greatest aggregation of intellectual talent of any company in American history.
Bob Noyce became very famous, very popular. He's sometimes called as God of Semiconductor.
Asian cultures really revere our successful innovators and scientists. You know, in China, Bill Gates is Britney Spears. Unfortunately, in America, Britney Spears is Britney Spears. And there's a huge difference.
Because of the integrated circuit, there is going to come a time when we all have portable telephones, personal paging systems, and palm-sized TVs.
Back in Syosset, Long Island, the corporate management viewed Fairchild just as a cash cow and, wanted to just milk it.
They know who they are and they know what they've got, and their parent company doesn't see it. like Shockley. They said, why are we making other people rich? Let's just go do it ourselves.
When I left and went to Teledyne,
I knew he was talking with them. The next thing I heard, he and Jean Herny and Sheldon Roberts were bailing out.
That started this whole pattern of a successful company starting up and doing well in Silicon Valley, leading to a lot of chip industry veterans who go off and start their own spin-offs of companies. 6
of the 8 finally left.
And so Silicon Valley begins then with the explosion of the fair children, as they're called.
there was this huge bucket of unexploited technology all over the country. This thing was going to explode.
This thing started with Shockley, and then it went to Fairchild, and then they started all these permutations and combinations. Spin out after spin out after spin out. It's almost like an amoeba.
If you follow the whole family tree, because there were splinters from splinters, probably 100 companies came out of Fairchild.
It's just amazing to me when I go up there and think about when I was a 16-year-old kid out there picking apricots, the change that's taken place. There were 2,000 apricot growers in Silicon Valley at the time I was there. Now there are 0.
Cramming more components onto integrated circuits. By Gordon E. Moore, Director, Research and Development Laboratories, Fairchild Semiconductor.
One of the major trade magazines, Electronics, asked me to predict what was going to happen in the next 10 years.
Integrated circuits will lead to such wonders as home computers, automatic controls for automobiles, and personal portable communications equipment.
The first integrated circuits had, I think, 8 components in it. We were working in the laboratory that time and could see something with around 60 coming out. And I plotted those on a piece of paper, and they were essentially all on a straight line, growing exponentially.
These devices are getting twice as powerful every 18 months. They're doubling in power every 18 months.
So I just said, okay, it's going to continue. For the next 10 years, we're going to double every year. We're going to go from 60 elements on an integrated circuit to 60,000.
And that really set the forward path. That if you look far enough down the road, you can conceive of astronomical levels of power and efficiency that really got people dreaming.
It's not just the power of computers. DNA sequencing is doubled every year. The amount of brain data we're gathering every year is doubling. The size of the internet, the number of bits we move around, even solar panels. It all grows at this exponential pace.
Anything that changes exponentially gets called Moore's Law. And I'll take credit for all of it.
What Gordon did by writing that law down is he gave a to-do list to the industry to deliver on for 40 years now.
Moore's Law put Silicon Valley on its maniacal cadence.
When the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop.
The U.S. Air Force adds the A-37 jet bomber to its growing arsenal of air power in Vietnam.
Suddenly, technology was making the guns that the flower children were poking with their little flowers.
My kid brother went to Vietnam. I don't think, frankly, that I connected the dots, that what we were doing had anything to do with Vietnam. We weren't making napalm. I guess realistically, the airplanes did have, flight control computers. There was definitely technology being used.
One of the assignments that I worked on at Fairchild, I did have a secret security clearance because these low current, high performance transistors could actually be used as fuses in bombs.
We saw what was happening, but it didn't affect us directly at all.
In the U.S., demonstrators took to the streets for a host of causes. At MIT, students attacked the university's involvement in defense programs.
Nobody talks politics. There's nobody arguing whether or not we should pull out of Vietnam. We were too busy doing our jobs.
Let us save our national honor. Stop the bombing and stop the war.
They were not out there in the streets. They were the guys who were annoyed because the tear gas kept them from getting to the lab. It was two revolutions taking place simultaneously, and they really didn't know that much about each other. And Shockley lands right in the middle of that.
The median Negro IQ almost always turns out to be not as good as the median white IQ. Is the failure of the Negro to escape from the ghetto a consequence of 300 years of legal inequality? Or is there a significant racial genetic component?
He published a great many articles claiming that African Americans were intellectually inferior to white people, and would always be because this was just part of their genetic makeup.
To fail to urge a sound diagnosis, determine if our national Negro illness is caused by problems of evolutionary adolescence, by environmental disadvantage, irresponsibility I do not propose to have on my conscience.
There were 3 or 4 people on the Stanford faculty who worked with him for a long time, myself included. He brought his first paper to several faculty members in the genetics department, including particularly Josh Lederberg, who was a Nobel laureate. He thought, well, you know, surely I'll get fair treatment from a Nobel laureate. And Josh looked at it and said, this is absolute nonsense.
The courage to doubt in the face of the desire to believe is the true mark of the scientist. The truth shall set you free.
So now it's going to be his Nobel Prize versus Lederberg's. It's him versus the genetics community. Crazy. Just crazy.
I think Shockley was more famous in many ways than the Silicon 8. I didn't know much about them. I didn't know who they were, but I knew vaguely who Shockley was. This was a guy who was a physicist, but he was spouting off about race and raciology, as he called it, and that was going against the grain of what was happening in the rest of society.
Basis, Negroes are relatively losing ground because of the anti.
Shockley thrived on controversy. He was probably loving every minute of it.
There are generations of people who believed that what Shockley was doing was racist, and I thought, wait a minute, you know, this guy needs a hearing.
Dear Mr. Fairchild, enclosed is a copy of my formal letter of resignation. Our personal situation has certainly been complicated by the fact that Semiconductor has for many years been more profitable than the company as a whole.
Fairchild Cameron Instrument went through their second CEO in a 6-month period.
And has been pushed hard for profitability.
Bob was the obvious internal candidate, and they were going to bypass him. Bob took that as a bit of an affront.
As Fairchild has grown larger and larger, I've enjoyed my daily work less and less. Perhaps it's because I grew up in a small town, enjoying all the personal relationships of a small town. Now we employ twice the total population of my largest hometown.
The hierarchical, more corporate types, you know, always thought, well, it's all about, you know, capital. But the real question is about human capital. Bob Noyce was a rock star.
It's not enough to simply say our objective is to grow and make profit. Everyone is trying to do that. I would rather find some small company which is trying to develop some product or technology which no one has done yet.
There was a feeling that existed in Silicon Valley that didn't exist in the East. You didn't have to worry about failing or changing jobs. If you failed, that was just a good story to tell at a cocktail party, not the end of your career.
Bob Noyce called me one day and said, Gordon and I are leaving, and we're going to form a new company. Would you help us do it?
Investors. 6 fair children, 600. Rock, 300. Grinnell College, 250.
I guess we had never failed at anything before, so it didn't feel like it was a big risk, at least to me.
Within 48 hours, the whole thing was done. Intel was the only company I ever invested in that I was 100% sure would make it.
People are here because of their abilities. I see the company as much more of a cooperative venture than an authoritarian structure.
From day one, Bob and Gordon decided to change some of the things they didn't like about Fairchild and put those philosophies in place here.
It's a community rather than an army.
They were just so determined that it would be a flat, democratic kind of organization, which was pretty much a new idea.
We were sitting around allocating stock options, and one of us said, well, why don't we just give them to all employees?
Internal correspondence, all employees, from R.N. Noyce. Here's the update contained in the revised prospectus reporting third quarter results.
We started hiring college students by the hundreds. They didn't have a clue what a stock option was.
In fact, I contacted an attorney to find out a little bit more about what it implied. And he said, well, you know, there may be some benefit or not. Turned out to be a very great benefit.
I just thought it was a great plan to make employees shareholders. I mean, it's my company. People cared.
When the board offered stock to me, I was kind of overwhelmed by it.
Everyone thought the game changers were Woodstock, counterculture track, protests in the streets. And nobody noticed the real game changers going on, which were guys in white shirts, short-sleeve shirts with buzz cuts, sitting in labs, like at Intel.
Youth was a great motivator. We didn't know it couldn't be done, so we went and did it.
I remember being at Intel, working when the man landed on the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The moments when you look back and say, gee, yeah, we have done that. It's a very good feeling.
A third of the colleges experienced some sort of protest activity. They'd been demanding that the U.S. get out of Southeast Asia, and Nixon seems now to be digging in. It's like putting a match to a giant fuse, setting fire to explosive tempers and pent-up emotions of students. At Kent State in Ohio, the burning of the ROTC building prompts Ohio Governor James Rhodes to call out the National Guard. When the smoke clears, 4 students are dead. 9 are wounded.
Nixon is definitely looking at students as the enemies in the country right now.
Some groups. And let me emphasize, I guess I said.
About 45 Grinnell students occupied the ROTC building Tuesday, protesting the excursion into Cambodia and the shootings at Kent State.
Kent State, I think in some sense, felt like a kindred campus.
After about 8 hours of stormy debate, a set of proposals was drawn up and a student strike was called.
Noyce received a phone call from the president of Grinnell asking him to come back and basically calm people down.
Instead of drawing people together for the mutual good, our society seems to be polarizing itself into antagonistic groups, each with little regard for the rights of the other.
He didn't like any of the kinds of stuff that was going on. He didn't approve of the policies. But he wasn't a particularly political animal either.
Bob really wanted to leave the world in a better place than he found it. That was his mission.
Bob Noyce believed technology was going to make the world a better place for everybody. In the end, those two great revolutions did merge, technology and culture. And eventually, some of those counterculture guys joined the digital revolution. Take Steve Jobs.
He was a kid, so I would invite him to come for dinner. And he and Bob left talking about ideas, and so he just sort of started showing up.
I think Steve Jobs tried very hard in the early days to model himself after Bob Noyce. And here he is now, the defining figure of the electronics age.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge shared is power multiplied.
I remember he asked me a question, what I thought the next big event or direction semiconductor technology should take. And lucky guess, I said memory.
Semiconductor memory. Complex integrated circuits used to store information in the form...
Semiconductor memory is what holds the ones and zeros, the information, and stores it, like the memory in our brains, for future use. It makes everything from the cell phone to the personal computer possible. Intel began as a memory company.
All you had to do is connect the dots. All you had to do is look at the invention of the transistor and then the integrated circuit and then the progress the integrated circuit had made.
Basic strategy. Establish semiconductor memories, standardize the chips.
People never thought that solid-state memory would be what it is today.
In 1970, I published an article projecting that we'd get the cost of semiconductor memory to a penny a bit by 1972. Today, you get more like 10 million bits or more for every penny you spend.
We were purely a memory house, really simple from a manufacturing standpoint. We probably made 90% of the world's supply at that point in time.
I was employee number 98. By 75, we were almost 6,000. It was huge, all over the world.
He came to Japan quite often to sell memory. So many of the computer people, they tend to believe that semiconductor memory is the way to go.
If every wristwatch sold in America is not Japanese, every wristwatch TV set will be.
The market for electronics had exploded, and suddenly Japan had its niche. And it was a huge niche.
Japanese industry turned to the innate ability of her engineers and artisans to copy virtually anything with incredible skill.
I remember very early on at Intel, we would have groups of Japanese businessmen come through, and they would all have cameras.
Well, they would just take pictures of everything.
Pictures of things that suddenly appeared elsewhere.
Well, you know, we didn't realize that that's what they were really doing.
And so that stopped.
Good evening. When the 20th century comes to a close, historians may well record it not as the era of the auto, nor that of nuclear energy.
Consumer electronics changed the meaning or image of made in Japan.
Historians may also note that in addition to originating and nurturing a vibrant semiconductor industry, the United States also lost it, like the steel industry and the TV market, to foreign competition.
Silicon Valley awoke to discover that Japan had caught them.
They built, at the time, a device of superior quality. That was the Sputnik of our life.
This is a problem that demands the attention of government at all levels. They are supporting the crude oil of the industry.
It was awfully hard for several of us to swallow that they had actually passed us. Noyce was one of the first ones to really beat on that.
They're trying to slit our throats. As far as the Japanese are concerned, the time to throw up a block to a karate chop is before it lands, not after.
There was a fear that the American semiconductor industry was going to be destroyed, by the Japanese.
With electronics now the country's largest employer, the fight is critical.
I would say Noyce felt betrayed in the same way that William Shockley had felt betrayed by the Fairchild 8. I helped to make you who you are, and now you're turning around and competing with me and beating me? That had to hurt.
Shockley here.
Yes, hello, this is Syl Jones from Playboy
I knew he
International.
recorded telephone calls. He and his wife, Emmy, assessed the interviewer over those phone calls. So I kept waiting for him to say, all right, are you black or are you white? But he never asked me if I was black or white. He simply asked me if I understood his work.
Well, why don't you come out and meet me? My Palo Alto office.
I went to see him with a photographer. He instinctively reached for the photographer's hand and said, hello, Mr. Jones, how are you? And I said, no, I'm Mr. Jones. And the look on Shockley's face at that time was like he'd seen a ghost. I remember Shockley saying, I'm going to have to give you a test, which I somehow managed to pass. And so he said, you are the exception that proves the rule of black inferiority. It was like interviews at 10 paces. He was actually recording me as I was recording him. So I asked him about this issue of dysgenics.
It's an important word to get into the vocabulary of the public. Dysgenics. Evolution without progress. Retrogressive evolution, which decreases the quality of the species.
Shockley's main point in the interview was that more people who had lower IQs were producing more children and therefore decreasing the IQ pool of the country.
Those that will suffer the most are the babies born to these families. Babies that may be so genetically disadvantaged that they can't escape from these bad environments.
The truth, though, was that Shockley never knew any black children. He never knew any black families. He claimed to be a humanitarian, but anybody could see that he wasn't. I do remember asking him, why would anybody listen to a Nobel Prize winner in physics talking about this particular subject?
This situation places me in a position like the one I occupied when my team was probably alone in trying to create the transistor. And the dysgenic problem is of far greater importance than that was. It's been around since the days of the Greeks. The transistor will, in due course, probably be replaced by something else, just as the vacuum tube was replaced by the transistor. But the human quality problems I'm talking about are going to be with us until some new stage arrives.
Bob said something like, we have a tiger by the tail here. That was the expression he used.
Microprocessor. Integrated circuit that contains the entire...
Sitting in their back lab, they had the biggest breakthrough in the history of electronics, the microprocessor. This becomes the equivalent of the central processor of a computer. It's memory and logic and linear operations all on one chip.
This is going to change the world. Everything will happen electronically.
It came down then to a decision. Should Intel stay in the memory business and slug it out with the Japanese, or take one of the biggest gambles in American business history and abandon memory?
I remember executives at Intel saying, the total production of computers in the world is less than 25,000 a year. There's just, the computer business isn't big enough for us to make microprocessors. Bob Noyce said, this is not going to be just replacing computers.
Soon, you'll have microprocessors buried in your appliances. In the factory, there'll be a vastly increased use of robots, traffic lights, and medical instruments, thermostats, and communications will help create new integrated global financial system.
Every 10 years, we basically take the most powerful computer in the world and we shrink it down to a chip. And then we use those chips to build the next most powerful computer in the world, and we do it again.
A bunch of nerds in Silicon Valley created a world where the iPhone, the PC, all of these things that have become tools of our daily life, they're the key drivers of our economy today.
We were the real revolutionaries.
There's now the Fairchild 8 million. There are so many more people out there who can be the Fairchild 8 and pursue their imagination farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before.
There's probably 1 billion transistors for every person on the planet. And it all started with William Shockley.
Bob and I were at a party, and I see Shockley, and I knew that they hadn't spoken ever since Bob had left Shockley, because Bill Shockley wouldn't talk to any of those people.
They had a book signing ceremony at some place in Atherton here, and he showed up. That was the first time I saw him.
His mother had died fairly recently, so I just went over and said how sorry I was that May had died, and tried to start a conversation. He actually talked to me, so then I'm going to Bob, like, come over, come on. And they did. They had a little talk. I think that was the only time they did.
Basically, the idea would be that in order to have a legal child, a woman would have to bring a certificate which she would have acquired.
William Bradford Shockley, a Nobel laureate whose work helped shape the modern world, died of cancer of the prostate at his California home on Saturday. He was 79.
Every girl on becoming 17 years old would be given a certificate which would entitle her to have, say, 2.2 legal children.
His early contributions to the transistor and the birth of Silicon Valley, however, will likely be overshadowed by his controversial pronouncements on race.
William Shockley was actually called the Moses of Silicon Valley because he brought the people to the promised land, but was denied entrance himself.
When I heard that Shockley had died, I thought to myself, I know he's died alone because he was on that journey. And I felt sad about the fact that he had died and that he wouldn't probably get the kind of accolades he should have gotten. Science, if it doesn't get out of somebody's head and can't inspire people to understand its benefit to human beings, is really not very useful to us. And that's in the end why I think Shockley is a cautionary tale. Because although the man was brilliant, he was really unable to foresee how his own abilities, not to mention the things he discovered, could best benefit mankind.
In a lot of ways, Bob Noyce and William Shockley were diametric opposites.
Robert Noyce was the one who actually was a visionary in thinking about what this would mean. And he believed it would affect ultimately everything.
The world wasn't very electronic when the 8 of us got together. We take these things for granted now.
Every American should know who Bob Noyce is.
The awful irony is that even in death, Bill Shockley and Bob Noyce are forever connected. There's been nothing like the shockwave that went through Silicon Valley the day Bob died. It just killed this town. Shockley was an old man. He was nearly 80 years old, but to have Bob Noyce die of a heart attack at 62 just a year later just seemed impossible. Can you imagine our world without the Fairchild 8? They gave us the model of how you work and how you live in the electronics age.
You know, when I was a kid, I remember walking home from Coney Island in Brooklyn to Brighton Beach, where I lived, and many times there'd be snow on the ground, and I get to walk along the boardwalk for about 1.5 miles to where my house is, and I'm the only footsteps in sight. Happens once in a while. Not often, but once in a while.
Come on, Zola, let's go. What was the movie about?
Everything.
Don't be encumbered by history. Go off and do something wonderful.